Okay, so get ready because today we are diving into some seriously wild stuff.
Yeah, this one is a doozy.
We're talking psychological warfare and this paper that reads like a blueprint for a supervillain.
Oh, tell me more.
It's called From PSYOP to MindWar, The Psychology of Victory.
Shitchy.
Right. It's a U.S. Army paper from way back in 1980, and it's basically all about conquering minds instead of territories.
So it's kind of like the ultimate propaganda playbook.
Basically, although the authors, Colonel Paul Valley and Major Michael Aquino, probably wouldn't call it propaganda.
What's the difference? Isn't it all just mind games?
Well, they saw it as something much bigger, more sophisticated. They actually challenged the traditional military approach.
Which is...
Focusing on physical domination, bombs, bullets, that sort of thing. They argued that winning hearts and minds should be the primary goal, not just a side effect.
And they thought you could actually achieve that through something like this mind war.
They believe so, yeah. And they weren't messing around. Right from the jump, they talk about a complete shift in strategy.
So how do you even begin to wage war on an entire population's mind?
Well, they called it strategic communication, which sounds pretty vague, right?
Yeah, a little bit.
But essentially, they were talking about influencing the perceptions and behaviors of entire populations, both enemy and domestic, to achieve your strategic goals.
Okay, so it's not just about winning over the enemy, it's about shaping the narrative at home, too.
Absolutely. They understood the importance of public opinion.
So how do they propose to actually do this? Are we talking subliminal messages, brainwashing on a mass scale?
Well, they do touch on some fringe theories.
Like what?
Later we can get into how they talk about things like electromagnetic activity and air ionization could, subtly influence a population.
Okay, that's a little out there.
Right. Like how much can the weather really affect our minds?
Right. I'm skeptical but intrigued.
Me too. But at its core, this mind war strategy was about something they called hyper-targeted persuasion. It's kind of like marketing, but on a much grander and more ethically complex scale.
What do you mean?
Well, think about it. To be truly effective, you need to understand your target audience's psychology, their culture, their vulnerabilities, and then tailor your message accordingly.
So you're not just blasting out a message to the masses. You're crafting specific messages for specific groups of people.
Exactly. It's about appealing to their core values and desires, making them think that what you want is actually what they want.
That sounds incredibly manipulative.
Oh, it absolutely is. And the authors knew it. They even argue that this approach is much more effective than traditional propaganda, which often relies on deception or misinformation.
Which backfires eventually, right? Because if you keep getting lied to, you eventually catch on.
Right, and that's where they argue that something called rapport comes in.
Rapport?
Yeah.
Like building a relationship.
Exactly. They say that for mind war to be truly effective, you need to establish a sense of trust and credibility with the target audience. You need to make them feel like you're on their side.
I guess that makes sense. Think about how we're drawn to certain news sources or personalities, right? We tend to gravitate towards voices we already trust.
Exactly. It's about creating that intangible connection that makes us more receptive to a particular message, and that's what they believed was key for shaping perceptions and influencing behavior on a mass scale.
So if I'm understanding this correctly, you're saying this mind war thing is about understanding a target audience's deepest desires, building trust and credibility, and then presenting your agenda as being in their best interest.
That's a pretty good summary.
It's pretty heady stuff.
It is. And the paper doesn't shy away from the ethical implications of all this either. But despite all the potential for manipulation, the authors maintain that mind war should be about communicating an inevitable truth.
Inevitable truth. Okay, now you have to explain that one. What does that even mean?
Yeah, it's a loaded term for sure. And it's something we're going to unpack in more detail as we dive deeper into this mind war business. So last time we were talking about mind war needing to be hyper-targeted.
Right, like that whole know your audience thing.
Exactly, and this is where things start to get really interesting and kind of creepy. Well, because the authors of this paper, they didn't just focus on the obvious stuff.
Like what? What else did they think was important?
Well, they were really interested in how things like electromagnetic activity, then, get this, air ionization, could affect a population's mindset.
Wait, hold on. Are we saying the weather can be used as a weapon now?
That's what it sounds like, right? And I know it sounds crazy, but they were convinced that these environmental factors could subtly influence how receptive people are to certain ideas.
So you're saying if you want to launch a mind war campaign, you should check the weather forecast first.
Well, they weren't suggesting we could control the weather outright or anything. I mean, this was 1980, not some sci-fi movie. But they did think it was important to be aware of these natural fluctuations and, if possible, time your messages for maximum impact.
So like if you know a particular region is experiencing a heat wave.
You might tailor your message differently than you would if that same region were, say, in the middle of a blizzard.
Exactly. You tap into the existing emotional climate, so to speak.
Which is both brilliant and incredibly unsettling if you think about it. It's like they're taking something we perceive as totally random and neutral, the weather, and figuring out how to weaponize it.
Well, it all speaks to the broader point they're making, which is that mind war is about understanding and exploiting every possible advantage to achieve your objective.
Right. Psychological, cultural, even environmental, you name it.
Exactly. It's about being adaptable, thinking several steps ahead of your adversary, and shaping the entire strategic landscape.
So it's not just about winning the current battle, it's about dictating the terms of the entire war before it even begins.
Now you're getting it. And this is where the authors of MindWar take things even a step further.
Oh, how so?
Well, they argue that this whole psychological influence thing shouldn't just be reactive, it should be proactive.
Okay, now you're losing me a little. What does it even mean to be proactive in a mind war? Give me an example.
Okay, so instead of just responding to your adversary's moves, you're using mind war to anticipate and even manipulate their actions. You're essentially creating a reality where they feel like they have no choice but to play by your rules.
So it's not just about winning the game, it's about rigging the entire system in your favor.
Precisely. Mind war, as they envision it, is about achieving a level of strategic dominance where traditional warfare becomes almost irrelevant. You've already won the psychological battle.
Okay, now this all sounds fascinating in theory, but did any of it actually work, or was this just some armchair generals theorizing about things they didn't fully understand?
Well, it's important to remember that mind war, as described in this paper, was never officially adopted as U.S. military doctrine.
So it was never put into practice?
Not exactly. You see, in his 2003 introduction to the paper, Micheal Aquino, one of the original authors, argued that elements of mind war were used during the Gulf Wars.
Really? You're saying the Gulf Wars weren't just about military might, there was a psychological element to them too?
According to Aquino, yes. He argues that shaping public perception both domestically and internationally was a key objective in those conflicts. Think about how the first Gulf War, for example, was portrayed in the media.
Right, it was all over the news. Those images of smart bombs and precision strikes, it all seemed so clean, almost surgical.
Exactly. And Aquino argues that this was a very deliberate strategy to shape the narrative, to portray the conflict as this kind of bloodless, decisive victory.
So they understood, even back then, the power of controlling the message, of using the media to influence how people perceive events.
Absolutely. And this is where this paper becomes even more relevant today. Think about it. We live in a world saturated with information. The lines between reality and perception are constantly being blurred, especially with social media.
It's like everyone with a Twitter account has a platform to wage their own little mind war campaign now.
Exactly. And that's something the original authors of this paper could never have anticipated. The sheer scale and speed at which information and misinformation can spread in the digital age.
So this paper that we thought was just a relic of the Cold War?
It's become even more relevant than ever. It's like a playbook for how conflicts are waged and won in the 21st century.
And not just conflicts between nations, right?
Right? Think about it. These mind war tactics are used every day in the corporate world, in politics, even in our personal lives.
Oh, I'm sure. Give me some examples.
Well, think about the way products are marketed to us, how political campaigns are run, even how we present ourselves on social media.
It's all about shaping perceptions, influencing behavior, getting what you want.
Exactly.
So what you're saying is, this mind war stuff, it's not just some abstract military theory anymore.
It's all around us, all the time. And the more aware we are of it, the better.
It's almost like we're living in the Matrix or something.
Right, like how much of what we believe is actually our own and how much of it has been, well, implanted.
Exactly. And if you don't even realize it's happening, how can you possibly fight it?
You can't. That's why shining a light on these tactics, becoming aware of how they work, is so crucial.
So knowledge is the first line of defense.
This is a good place to start, yeah. Remember what we were saying about rapport and trust?
How we naturally gravitate towards voices we already agree with.
Exactly. Now apply that same principle to things like targeted advertising, social media algorithms, the stuff that's designed to keep us scrolling.
Because the algorithms, they learn what we like, what we respond to.
Right. And they keep feeding us more and more of it. It creates these echo chambers where our existing beliefs are just constantly being reinforced.
And then we wonder why everyone seems so divided these days.
Exactly. It's like we're being primed for mind war without even realizing it.
And it's not just about the content itself either, right? It's the way it's delivered the messenger.
Exactly. Think about the influencers you follow online. Yeah. The brands you support, the news sources you trust. It's all connected.
So what are we supposed to do? Question everything. Everyone.
Especially the stuff that seems legit, the stuff you agree with.
Because the more convinced you are of something,
The less likely you are to question it.
and that's what makes us vulnerable.
Exactly. So how do we navigate a world where it feels like everyone is trying to get inside our heads?
That's the million-dollar question. Where do we even start?
Well, I think the first step is cultivating a healthy sense of skepticism. Question your assumptions.
Don't just take things at face value.
Exactly. Seek out different perspectives, even the ones that make you uncomfortable. And don't be afraid to change your mind when presented with new information.
It's really about remembering that we have the power to think for ourselves, right?
Absolutely. We don't have to let algorithms and influencers do our thinking for us.
So the best defense against mind war is really just being aware of it.
Exactly.
Understand the tactics, question everything, and never underestimate the power of our own minds.
Well put. We've covered a lot of ground today.
We have. From Cold War mind games to modern-day manipulation, this deep dive into mind war has been, well, eye-opening, to say the least.
It makes you realize just how much of our world is shaped by forces we don't even see.
Invisible battles are being fought for our hearts and minds every single day.
So stay vigilant out there.
And stay curious. We'll see you next time for another deep dive.